This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here at the IIEA in Dublin. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, our first event in the 2024 IIEA Disability Policy Series. So the second year we've run this series, but the first year of 2024. Today we're going to hear about inclusivity for persons with disabilities, the electoral rights of persons with disabilities in the European Union. And we're absolutely thrilled and indeed honoured to be joined by our speaker, Alejandro Moledo, who's the Deputy Director of the European Disability Forum. Anything around inclusivity, electoral rights are always important, especially for a public policy think tank such as ours. But just this year, when so much of the world is going to vote and participate in elections, it feels all the more important. Alejandro is going to be chaired and moderated today by someone who will be known to many of you on the call. Dr. Vivian Rath is good enough to chair these events on behalf of the IIEA, and it's much appreciated. Vivian is a well-known human rights activist and defender, and he's a research fellow at Trinity College Dublin. Just the final word from me, for those of you on the call, there is Irish Sign Language interpretation available. Many thanks to our interpreter, and there will also be closed captions. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Viv. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Barry. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here on these sessions. And it's hard to believe that this is number 4 of the sessions focusing on disability that the IIEA has run. And they've been very successful. And thank you to the IIEA for moving the dial that little bit more forward and working to ensure the greater inclusivity of all disabled people and ensuring that we have a place at this discussion table as well. So thank you, Barry, for that. It's with great delight that we're joined today by Alejandro Moledo, Deputy Director of the European Disability Forum, who has been generous enough to give us his time. I just want to note, though, a little bit of housekeeping. For our webinars, it's important to note that the initial address and the Q&A session are on the record unless otherwise stated. I would ask you to submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we really welcome questions because in actual fact some of the most interesting parts of the discussion result from your questions, so please do send them in. We would ask that when you're putting in your question that you identify yourselves and your affiliation before asking the speaker a question. So that's quite important. Please endeavour to ensure that you take maybe some time to maybe tweet, and our handle is at IIEA, and we welcome the tweets because it's important to keep that discussion going on afterwards. So Alejandro will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we will have our Q&A. In his address, Mr. Moledo will give an overview of the findings of the European Disability Forum 6th Human Rights Report, which is entitled Political Participation of People with Disabilities. The report outlines the legal and practical barriers that persons with disabilities face when exercising their electoral rights in the EU elections across the 27 EU member states. This includes the right to vote, the right to stand as a candidate, the accessibility of the elections, proceedings, facilities or materials, and accommodations for independent and secret voting. A reminder today again, just that this presentation is on the record. And I just want to say a few words about Mr. Moledo now as well. As mentioned, he's the Deputy Director of the European Disability Forum, and he leads and coordinates the EDF's advocacy and policy work at EU level. He also supports the work of the European Parliament Disability Intergroup. Mr. Moledo is also a member of the Spanish blind organisation ONCE, ONCE, for which he previously worked as a journalist and regional representative of young visually impaired people. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Moledo at the recent National Disability Authority conference in Ireland, where he also presented on this work. And I think you're really going to find it extremely interesting. Alejandro, you can now take the stage.
Many thanks, Vivian, and many thanks as well to IIEA for the kind invitation to present to you the work of the European Disability Forum in regards to political participation, and more particularly the electoral rights of persons with disabilities. Can I have my slides on? And we can, yeah, there you go. So next slide, please. So I'll try to make it as brief as possible, but I will show you the findings and the main recommendations of our human rights report. But first, let me introduce the European Disability Forum. For those of you who don't know us, we are the advocacy organization representing persons with disabilities at European level. We have over 100 member organizations, members at European level, such as the European Blind Union, the European Union of the Deaf, the European Federation of Hard of Hearing, Inclusion Europe, and those organizations at national level that represent the disability community. In the case of Ireland, DFI. So we are run by persons with disabilities and their families for persons with disabilities, and our goal is basically to ensure that the EU implements the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we do so by involving the European disability movement in the policy making at European level, following the motto that we all know in the disability movement: nothing about us without us. Next slide, please. So this series of the Human Rights Report, we launched last year the 7th Human Rights Report on employment, and this year we will issue the report looking at equality before the law. So looking at how member states are moving away, hopefully, from substituted decision-making to supported decision-making. So what we do in this series is to take one of the articles of the CRPD. In the case of today's presentation, we will look at Article 29 on political participation, and we really look at the indicators that could help us to compare and find good practices and solutions in the implementation by the EU member states, drawing some recommendations for national and European policymakers. In the case of this human rights report, the political participation, we, as it was mentioned, we looked at the legal but also the practical barriers that prevent persons with disabilities from exercising their political rights. We looked at mostly the European Parliament elections, also a little bit on municipal elections, because as you may know, the EU citizenship also grants us with the possibility to vote for the European Parliament and for municipal elections in another member state that we reside in. So in my case, for example, I'm Spanish, but I live in Belgium, and I could, and I actually do, vote in the Belgian municipal elections, but I can decide whether I vote for the European, for the European Parliament elections with Belgian candidates or with Spanish candidates. We looked at in this report not only on those kind of barriers for the European Parliament elections, both legal and practical, but we also looked at cases that brought substantial change at national level. So those cases in which our members ran a campaign to change the law, those cases of strategic litigation also run by disability activists and by disability organizations. And we conclude by some recommendations, again, for national and European policymakers. And at the end of my presentation, I will also give you a little bit of an overview on the different advocacy campaigns that we have undertaken in this regard. So to ensure the right to vote of persons with disabilities, the right to stand as candidates, and the accessibility of the European elections, of all elections in the end. Next slide, please. So let's go into the topic, let's say. So actually we do have now 705 members of the European Parliament, MEPs. They will soon become 720 in the upcoming European Parliament elections this June. And just a brief note on the number of MEPs, less than 5% of them, according to our knowledge, have a disability. So still not fully representative of the 15% of the total population that persons with disabilities represent. For the European elections, even if we talk about European elections, we cannot say that this is just one election. In reality, these are 27 national elections. At European level, we, as a matter of fact, we do not have an electoral management body to oversee the European elections. So this kind of variety and diversity of electoral systems at national level makes it challenging to come up with kind of harmonized recommendations on how to make the European elections accessible and inclusive to persons with disabilities. But nevertheless, we found some grounds and some possibilities to advocate for this, and I will get into that a little bit later. So let's move on to the different systems that we have in Europe. I will not spend too much time on this. Next slide, please. Basically, in the EU, we have three different voting systems. We have two countries, one of them, Ireland, in which you have single transferable vote. And then in 19 countries, we have the possibility of a preferential vote, whereas in 6 countries in the European Union, the lists are closed. So you just pick the political parties' ballot paper, and you cannot have a preferential vote. You just go with whatever the party has decided. This is the case of my home country, Spain, for example. So next slide. This variety in the way we vote also poses, as you can imagine, some challenges when it comes to how to make the casting the vote accessible, because in some countries you need to write an X. In other countries, you need to circle the candidate that you want to vote for. In some countries, you need to use, in Romania, for example, you need to use a special stamp on a small booklet. In some countries, you even need to write the name of the. You can write the name of the candidate. In Belgium, for example, we have voting machines. In Estonia, you can vote through a website or through your mobile phone. So you can see this variety in how we cast the vote also needs to take into consideration in how we ensure the inclusivity of the elections. Next slide. In addition to how we vote, there are different ways in which we can exercise this right. So now I will show you some data on the different modalities or the different means for voting that people have in Europe. Some of these solutions are actually put forward just for persons with disabilities, but here we kind of compile those alternative and advanced means of voting that are available in the European Union. So we have in-person early voting that is available in 11 countries. So you go to a location, and this obviously can be convenient for certain persons with disabilities if such location is accessible to them, and they can avoid the election day if they wish so, and vote more calmly if possible in this kind of early voting place. Next slide. We also have 9 countries, well, actually now 10, because Greece is actually now reforming their electoral law, and they are including postal voting, so the possibility to vote by post. And this, again, this can be a convenient solution for persons with disabilities, so you can decide your vote at home using your own assistive technology, for example, or with the assistance of a person of trust, and you can vote by post, so you avoid going into the polling station and the hassle of going on election day. So these possibilities are in some cases convenient for certain persons with disabilities, which obviously, but I will get into that in a moment, this doesn't mean that countries shouldn't make efforts to make the polling stations accessible for persons with disabilities, obviously. Next slide. We also have the possibility in a number of countries to change or choose the polling station that is most accessible or most convenient to you. This is obviously something that many persons with disabilities value in the possibility of choosing this polling station. Next slide. And lastly, another possibility which is put forward in many cases for persons with disabilities and for people living in residential settings is to have the ballot box to come to your place. So mobile electoral commissioner come to your place and you can exercise the right to vote. In some countries, in the case of let me just check the numbers of 4 countries, this is only possible in certain locations, so in hospital, in residential institutions, but in many countries in the EU, 15 to be more precise, this possibility is available again. In many cases to persons with disabilities, even if in some countries we notice that the paperwork and the procedure to request this mobile ballot box is difficult. Next slide. So now we move to the legal, this is kind of the context, and now we'll move into the legal and practical barriers preventing persons with disabilities from exercising their electoral rights. First, we'll start with the right to vote and the right to stand as candidate. Next slide. With regards to the right to vote, as you may know, certain countries restrict this right to people under total or partial guardianship. Fortunately, we've seen and is shown in the report that lately there's been progress in EU countries in changing these kind of double standards as for persons mostly with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. So we see more and more countries that are ensuring that everyone, regardless of whether you are under guardianship, can exercise their right to vote. And here I'm very, very glad to tell you that there are 2 countries that recently have amended their laws to ensure that everyone, including those under guardianship, under total or partial substituted decision-making regimes, can actually exercise the right to vote. This is the case of Luxembourg, which changed their law last June, and Slovenia, who changed it very, very recently. And for the first time, 3,500 people under guardianship will be able to exercise the right to vote in the upcoming European elections. So now, all in all, finally, we have more than half of the EU member states ensuring that everyone, without exception, have the right to vote in the upcoming European elections. The number now is 15, not 13 as in the number on the slide. Sorry, this needs to be updated with the graphic designer. But for a moment, I just pasted the names of the countries that have joined, let's say, the progress on implementing the UN CRPD. Then, regardless, with regards to the countries that do exclude all or certain persons with disabilities, we have countries in which certain persons with disabilities on a case-by-case basis are deprived of the right to vote. This number has gone down to 6 now. And countries in which, regardless if you are under total or partial guardianship, as soon as you are put into this substituted decision-making regime, you automatically lose your right to vote. So these are the countries that really need to speed up their implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Next slide, please. which is the right to stand as candidate. And here we see that with the recent changes in Luxembourg and Slovenia, we have 10 EU countries in which persons with disabilities, regardless of their legal capacity, can stand as candidate to the European Parliament election. This is unfortunate that some countries do believe that certain people have the right to vote, but not the right to be a candidate. But this is the way it is, and we are working to promote that more and more candidates are persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. We move now to the practical barriers. So we will look at how we can ensure that persons with disabilities have equal access to the elections. Next slide. And here we will look at three aspects. First, accessibility. So accessibility of the proceedings, the materials, the information about the election. So not only the polling station or how to cast the vote. We will also look at reasonable accommodation in the case of electoral rights. And here, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, is key to ensure that those alternative and advanced means of voting are available, so persons with disabilities can choose what is most convenient or preferable to them, as well as the possibility of using assistive tools and services to vote independently and in secret, which is something that in the case of persons with disabilities is not always ensured. And in this same vein, we also look at the free choice of assistance, which, as you will see in a moment, is not guaranteed, despite this being explicitly mentioned in the convention that persons with disabilities have the right to choose a person of their trust to assist them in voting if they wish so. In certain EU member states, this is not possible, and you can only be assisted by an election official in the polling station, which obviously is problematic. Next slide. Going into the accessibility, the first pillar of this section, here we start obviously with how accessible are the ballot papers, or how accessible is the casting the vote, because as I mentioned before, in some cases, if you need to write or to circle the name of the candidate that you want to have a preferential vote for, this obviously poses problem for people like myself, for example, with a visual disability. So in the case of ballot papers, for example, in the case of Luxembourg that I just mentioned, in the reform, they also introduced certain elements to make the ballot paper more accessible, more usable, not only for persons with disabilities, but also for everyone, actually. So looking at the contrast of the ballot paper or the font, in Norway, for example, in their legislation, they even specify the font type and the font size of the ballot paper to ensure the legibility of the ballot paper and the understandability. So I know in Ireland, for example, you also made some changes in your ballot paper to improve the understandability and the usability of it. And obviously, and as in every aspect concerning accessibility, there is always room for improvement. Concerning the required task, what I mentioned, like how to mark the preferential vote, this is also a challenge that can be overcome in certain cases with assistive technology that we will show in a moment. And in the case of Estonia, which is the only country in which they can vote as an early vote through the internet, through a website, this website, which you can access through your computer or through your mobile phone, it complies with the web accessibility standards. So it's an accessible way for persons with disabilities to vote if they don't want to go to the polling station and doing it in person. Concerning the only two countries that use voting machines, Belgium is one of them and Bulgaria is another one. Unfortunately, the voting machines that we have in Europe do not include much accessibility features on it. So this is still a huge room for improvement. In the US, they have advanced in this aspect as they use voting machines, but nevertheless, the disability community is not yet totally satisfied with the level of accessibility. But again, accessibility, there is always room for improvement. Next slide. If we look at beyond the ballot paper and we look at the legislation, we see that now 19 countries, because Austria joined this group as well, have introduced direct or indirect legal provision as for the built environment that would cover polling stations. Again, sometimes they think of accessibility in a very narrow way, thinking only of people using wheelchairs. So here is where we see like good practices in certain member states in which they look at also the accessibility of people with intellectual disabilities or people with other forms of disability, not just, you know, reduced mobility, which is great. Next slide. And then if we look at the election information, which is obviously very important as well, we've seen that even if the European, the national election management bodies have different levels of accessibility of their websites and communication, we do see that more and more member states are cooperating actually with disability organizations to produce materials and to inform about the accessibility and the possibilities of the elections in place. And in the case of 5 election management bodies, for example, if I'm not mistaken, they do provide specific information about the accessibility of the polling station, which is obviously very useful for persons with disabilities. Next slide. Then another important elements of the elections are the political parties, no, and the media. We do have a certain legislation that ensures that audiovisual media services are or should become progressively accessible to persons with disabilities, and this could obviously cover information related to the elections, like candidates' debates or interviews with candidates and so forth. And we do see that some countries have really good practices in making political content more accessible to persons with disabilities. But on the other side, the political parties remain as a kind of like a voluntary basis, and this really depends on the political will of these parties to make their information and their communications more accessible. There is no law obliging them to do so. Next slide, please. And moving on to the second pillar, so reasonable accommodation, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we combine the provision of this alternative and advanced means of voting and the provision of assistive tools, we see that most EU member states, they do have certain, sorry? I've heard. So we see that the majority of member states, they do have the possibility of ensuring the provision of reasonable accommodation through these means, 23 in total. Only 4 countries do not have any kind of these alternative means for voting or do not provide assistive tools to ensure that you can vote independently and in secret. In 2 of these 4 countries, France and Belgium, for example, they claim that having the possibility of a proxy voting for you, which is possible in Belgium and France, you give the possibility for another person to vote on your behalf. They do claim that this could be considered as an alternative means of voting, but from our point of view, this is not a way to claim that you are complying with the obligations of the convention to ensure that persons with disabilities can exercise the right to vote. You are passing that duty to a third person, which is, yeah, can be a convenient way for people, but not a way to claim that you are complying with, you know, your commitments as for disability policies. Next slide. Yeah, and then, well, this I already mentioned at the beginning, the different ways for voting, early voting or alternative means of voting. So postal voting, in person, changing or choosing your polling station, and the possibility of having an election commission coming to your place of residence. Next slide. And if we look at the provision of assistive tools, we see that many countries, and actually in a number of them, is thanks to the disability organization cooperating with the electoral management authority. The countries provide certain assistive tools such as braille templates, tactile stencils as well, magnifiers in the polling station, lamps, the provision of accessible transport to the polling station, even helplines in sign language, for example. So there is a wide range of possibilities here for member states that, again, it really depends on the voting system that they have at national level. Next slide. And here included in the slide some pictures on the these assistive tools. So I believe actually that one of them is from Ireland, tactile stencil on the bottom right side. On the top right, there is a mobile ballot box. And then on the left side of the picture, there is, if I'm not mistaken, a braille kit. So information provided in braille. Next slide. And then if we look at the secrecy of the vote, this obviously depends on everything that we've been presenting until now. So the accessibility of the process and the provision of reasonable accommodation. So depending on how well suited these provisions are, the country will be ensuring the possibility of having a secret vote. But in the report, we also note certain countries in which the lack of these alternative means of voting, or the lack of, being able to choose a person of trust to assist you in voting, could compromise this principle of the secrecy of the vote. Next slide. And this is the case of Greece and Malta. I know that our Greek members are at the moment in discussions with the government to change the law to ensure that persons with disabilities can decide an assistance of their choice, and they are not, obliged to get help from an election official in the polling station. And obviously, if you think of a small community, a small village, you may not want to disclose your vote to a stranger. So our position in this regard is to allow persons with disabilities to decide whom will assist them in casting the vote. Next slide. And we come to the end of my presentation concerning the recommendations that we draw from all these findings and information. We just want to make sure that countries or national electoral laws or European electoral law, if we ever have a good one, will guarantee that everyone has the right to vote and the right to stand as candidate, regardless of legal capacity status. We obviously, from EDF, we are against any kind of substituted decision-making regime, and we welcome very much the progress that you've been making in Ireland in this regard with the new law on supported decision-making. We really hope it's a success. But for the sake of ensuring the electoral rights of persons with disabilities, we want to decouple, let's say, the right to vote and the right to stand as candidates, or your electoral rights, from the legal capacity status. We also promote accessibility by requiring member states to maximize the accessibility of the proceedings, the facilities, the materials, the information of their elections, but cater to their culture, to their voting system, the voting culture that they have at national level, because as you've seen in my presentation, the diversity of systems we have in Europe is immense. Well, immense, maybe too big, but quite great. And then to provide reasonable accommodations, so different ways of voting that are convenient for everyone, not only for persons with disabilities. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, that was proven again in Croatia, for example, when not only persons with disabilities use the mobile ballot boxes, people that could not leave their homes had to use these ballot boxes as well, these mobile ballot boxes as well. So the provision of alternative and advanced means of voting for all voters or for persons with disabilities are a way to ensure that people have a convenient way to exercise their right to vote, and the provision of assistive technologies that can facilitate that you can do it alone, independently, at your ease, is also important. And lastly, which is obvious and actually is explicit in the UN Convention, is to ensure that everyone can choose the person to assist them in. And as I mentioned in different parts of my presentation, one key success factor that we highlight in the report is that in those countries in which the electoral authority has cooperated with the disability organization is where it has worked the best, because at the end of the day, we are the experts of our own lived experiences, and knowing the peculiarities of the voting system at national level, the organization of persons with disabilities and the electoral authorities can do really work well together in finding these solutions to improve accessibility or introduce these kind of measures to ensure a reasonable accommodation. Next slide. And I think they will be my last one. Well, this is the promotion one, so I can paste the link on the chat box, but you can easily find it online. The report, I'm happy that it's outdated thanks to this kind of progress in Luxembourg, in Greece, and in Slovenia, and I hope that it will get more and more outdated. We need to find a way to update the maps. And then this last slide is to briefly mention the policy, the advocacy that we've been carrying out at EDF concerning the persons with disabilities and the political participation. The European Parliament has proposed a new EU electoral law, because believe it or not, we have the same kind of rules since 1976. And in this, we have worked very closely with the European Parliament, and we managed to include the recommendations, or most of the recommendations that I just mentioned, in this proposal to the Council. The Council is the EU institution that represents our national governments, our countries, and is the Council the only institution that can decide on an EU electoral law. So the Parliament has proposed, but it's a prerogative of the Council to decide if they take it or not. And for the moment, they have not taken it. It's a different story. The rights of citizens like myself, mobile EU citizens, residing in another EU member state. Here is the Commission that has the authority to propose new legislation, and they have introduced new legislation as for the electoral rights of mobile EU citizens like myself. So here we managed to include also some improvements as for accessibility of the elections, or the information to the mobile citizens. So this legislation actually have, in my view, this is a personal opinion, more chances to be adopted in the near future, not for these upcoming elections in June, but I believe these directives will be adopted. And then more recently, and good to check, the Commission has released one of the actions of the disability strategy. Is a guide, so it's not binding, but it's a good source of information, like our report, on a guide on good electoral practices for the participation of persons with disabilities in elections. I hope they can distribute these slides to you, so you have easily accessible the links. This guide kind of gathers these kind of best practices or projects at national level for the political participation of persons with disabilities. And at the annex of this guide, the Commission has included some sort of guidance, because even though it's titled guide, it's not guiding much, it's just a compendium of good practices, but good food for thought or for inspirations at national level on how to improve the voting system. So it's just worth mentioning. The Commission also released a recommendation to member states in which they mentioned that the persons with disabilities should be granted the right to vote. But in this case, they did not use our approach as for, regardless of legal capacity status. They recommend member state to do at the minimum like a case-by-case basis. So with the possibility for the person to seek redress or at the court to challenge that decision. But we believe that by default, everyone should have the right to vote. So we were not so satisfied, so pleased with the approach taken by the Commission in this regard. And lastly, in case you are interested, the OSCE also released a set of recommendations concerning the political participation of persons with disabilities. And next slide, and I think that's it. No, I included one more, sorry. I think I'm talking too much, but I will stop now. Basically, just to tell you about our plans for the upcoming European elections. I mean, this is an advocacy campaign that we are running to ensure the right to vote of persons with disabilities, to improve the accessibility of the elections. But this is not all, obviously. From the European Disability Movement, we are, as we always do, we are putting forward political proposals, like new ideas for the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the EU to really improve the living conditions of persons with disabilities, to put forward legislation that can be transposed, let's say, at national level for our members at national level, also to have this possibility to go beyond and really push for the implementation of the CRPD. So we have this manifesto for the upcoming European elections with loads of proposals. I think there are over 80. And based on the manifesto, we have recently launched a disability rights pledge that we hope you can distribute among your candidates to become MEPs in June. It's a pledge to commit, to work together with the disability movement, to implement the convention, to revise the current European disability strategy, to re-establish the European Parliament Disability Intergroup in the Parliament, because this is not a given. It needs to be re-established every term. And for these MEPs to join the Intergroup. So it's just a one-pager that candidates, commit to defend disability rights. We also at EDF have developed certain guidelines or checklists for political parties and candidates to run their campaigns, their communications, their events in an accessible manner. So it's kind of a easy to digest entry point into accessibility and how to make your communication, social media, meetings, etc. accessible. So you can access through that link as well. And our third kind of big objective of this campaign, or this European elections campaign, is to ensure, as I said before, that we have more policymakers with disabilities. At the moment, we have barely 5% of the total European Parliament with disabilities, and we want to see more people with disabilities as members of the European Parliament. So I stop there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that was the last slide. Yay. Good.
Alejandro, thank you very much.
Sorry, I talked a lot.
No, that's okay. I mean, there is a lot of information to cover, and it was a really insightful presentation. And I know, because I've read the EDF report on this, that is only a snapshot of the amount of detail and the amount of information that is in that report. So I think you did extremely well to capture so much of it, and in such a broad way. And what I really liked, of course, is that you detailed the many barriers that exist, but you also outlined some of the successes and some of the positive actions that are being taken in countries. And I think that's really important, because it also outlines to other countries or demonstrates to other countries that they can make changes, and these changes make a significant difference to the lives of disabled people. And when we just think about it, and just for our audience here today, that in 2022, the EU population over the age of 16, 27% of the EU population over the age of 16 had some form of disability. So when we look at that, that's about 101 million people, or 1 in 4 people, adults in the EU, I should say, with disability. So it's a huge amount of people that a huge voting bloc who have rights, and in many cases these rights are denied. And I know you spoke about that the fact that there are some barriers that exist to people with maybe psychosocial disabilities or mental health difficulties or intellectual disabilities that actually prevents them from voting altogether. And I think there's some kind of an estimation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alejandro, but I think it's put in around the 800,000 EU citizens you may be deprived of the right to participate in elections because of their disabilities.
Yeah.
I mean, Alejandro, that's phenomenal amount of people.
Yeah. It got reduced in the during these past years because of those big countries changing their national laws, like Germany, France, Spain as well. In fact, so it got reduced to it is estimated that around 400,000 now. So yeah. But still,
it's still a colossal number of people who are being disenfranchised, and not only that, but I mean the impact that must have on their sense of belonging in Europe.
Yeah.
Their sense of community, and the failure to be involved in the decision-making process. So, look, I mean, there are a number of questions after coming in, Alejandro. Have you had an opportunity to catch your breath? Because
yes.
you have to get some quick fire questions in now between now and we always finish at 1 p.m. Or sorry, 2 p.m. Here. So we try to keep it on time, you know. So I'm going to our first question came in from Emma Richardson, a researcher with the IIEA. So the question reads as follows, okay? You mentioned that less than 5% of current MEPs are persons with disabilities. As many people are now coming to understand not all disabilities are visible, do you think that candidates for the EU Parliament should identify their personal disabilities when becoming candidates? And could this be done to benefit disability awareness in general?
That's a good question. And I forgot, that's a really good question. And I forgot to mention that I mean, we calculated ourselves this percentage of 5%, but obviously this is based on our knowledge. So either because it's a visible disability or because the MEP himself or herself openly disclosed the disability. This doesn't mean that there may be other MEPs with invisible disabilities. So it's a really good point. The case of candidates disclosing whether they have a disability or not, I think this is, as always, our position is that this is up to the person to decide if they want to disclose or not their disability. Yeah, and sometimes even it is we tend to see that some policymakers think that because an MEP or a policymaker has a disability, that person should be working on disability policies, and it's not the case. It shouldn't be the case. Persons with disabilities can be working, and we do have actually in this legislative term, we have had MEPs with disabilities that have not disclosed their disability or with a visible disability, but that were not that active on disability matters. And it's totally fine, because disability should be everywhere. It's part of the diversity of our society.
Totally, yeah. And I think, of course, Alejandro, and you would know this as well from your work, is that disclosing a disability is a very personal point, and many may have experienced negative perceptions and negative and criticisms in relation to disability in their lifetime, and may not feel comfortable doing it. But what I noticed, Alejandro, and I just wanted to bring your point, you mentioned that that 5% figure, and that's actually, if I'm correct in saying, that's considered quite high, because if I know in some research that was done in the last year or two, I think in the UK and across other different countries in Europe, that in terms of their local parliaments or local areas, that that level of representation was 1% and less.
Yeah.
So,
but still far from the 15%, huh?
Entirely. I mean, I'm not celebrating 5% by no means. Unfortunately, we have no idea of the figure here in Ireland. And in actual fact, if you don't mind me saying so, myself and two other colleagues, Eleanor Flynn in University College Galway, and of course, Aoife Price in University Galway, and myself are doing some research in this elections on the experiences of disabled candidates. And this will be the first time that kind of research has been done here in Ireland, but we have no real idea of how many disabled people are actually in our current government, you know. Okay, so I have another question, and we have to try and get through all of these. People are very interested. I have a question from Niamh Hybrid, and I know Niamh was an alumni of Trinity College Dublin and a fantastic journalist. Welcome, Niamh. Delighted to have you here. In line with ensuring electoral rights and increased accessibility for people with disabilities, do you expect to see more disabled candidates participating in elections throughout EU member states, or is different action required?
We are doing our best, but it's up to the political parties to also set the right context, let's say. We all, I mean, in what we've seen in the presentation, that we have a wide variety of voting systems, but at the end of the day, it's also in all our countries we have more or less strong political parties that they should have also the responsibility of making their meetings, their headquarters, their communication, and their information accessible and inclusive, and to proactively approach their members with disabilities, because persons with disabilities also have different ideologies. Sometimes it seems like we should also have since we have a disability. No. We all have different ideologies, different political views, and parties should make a proactive effort, this is our view, to approach persons with disabilities and to include them in their tickets. And we've sent letters to the EU political parties, but as you know well, even these are European elections, the candidates are decided by the national parties. So it is really a campaign that will be mostly led by national disability activists and disability organizations, to reach out to the political parties, to really encourage them to approach persons with disabilities and include them and give them a chance and support them as candidates so they can campaign on equal footing with other candidates.
I think it's very interesting, Alejandro, and you have probably noted this as well, that our first two questions today actually relate to disabled people running as candidates.
Yeah, so there is an appetite. There is an appetite, yes.
Yeah, I think there is, and I'm just thinking, do you think that countries are taking too narrow a view when it comes to the public and political participation of disabled people, as in the focus is usually accessibility of voting stations as opposed to considering supports for disabled candidates? What are your thoughts, Alejandro?
I think it's shifting. I think it's shifting slowly but surely, as everything, unfortunately, but it's shifting, and we have seen progress. I showed that there's been progress in certain elements, and we've seen that, for example, the latest one that we have, the the changes in Slovenia and in Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, for example, they also took this opportunity to make their ballot paper more accessible. And in Slovenia, since they changed the national law, they not only changed it for persons with disabilities under guardianship to be able to vote, but also to be able to stand as candidates. So, but nevertheless, as we showed in the slide, the number of countries ensuring the right to vote regardless of legal capacity status, is higher than those ensuring the right to stand as candidates. So we still see this kind of double standard, if you wish, that is not yet there, but we see progress at least.
Mm. Well, and I think, you know, it's great as well to see, and you can help me with the pronunciation, Alejandro, Margalastarian, making history in Spain, where she was. Am I right in pronouncing that correct?
You mean the MP with intellectual disability?
Yes, that's grand. Yeah, Margal Seran.
Yeah. She's in my region in Valencia. Yes. Yeah.
And it's fantastic that somebody is breaking the mold, but I'm sure that person had to overcome very significant societal challenges in order to access that. But hopefully we can see more of that in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question in here from Dorothy Stewart. Thank you, Dorothy. Dorothy asked the question, voter apathy is also a challenge across many countries, regardless of ability. And is this accounted for in your figures presented?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
So voter apathy?
Voter apathy. Yeah. Well, but that's a condition that affects us all as society, not just persons with disabilities. But yeah, I think this is this is serious, and from our, let's say, bit of responsibility as the European Disability Forum, we are doing our best to try to show why voting in the European elections is important. I think we have launched, we are launching, actually, we are preparing materials on reasons to vote. Like it's not only the, electing MEPs that have big salaries and all. It's about your rights as a passenger. It's about the accessibility of products and services in the whole EU internal market. It's about anti-discrimination laws when you travel across countries. It's about the European Disability Card. It's about, there are so many competencies that affect our everyday life that are decided at European level, that what we are trying to do is to compile them. And we have a great report, by the way, that I didn't include in the slides. It's called Your Rights in the EU. We will revise it this year. And here we kind of compile all the rights that persons with disabilities have achieved at European level. So this is what it's at stake. So it's not only the proposals that we as disability movement are putting forward to political parties. It's about, the rights that we have that are not, set on stone. If tomorrow we have, all the Eurosceptics taking over the Parliament and the Commission and basically going backwards, I mean, we could lose rights in Europe. So
absolutely, Alejandro. Yeah. Absolutely. So, and I think that's a really good point there that you're making. That, and there's an article in one of the papers in Ireland here at the moment, in where the comment is that it's important to use our vote to see the change that the change that we want. So, and I think that's you're making that point. The last question here before we finish, Alejandro, is from Kieran Finlay. Hi, Kieran. I know Kieran as well. We have a very good Irish contingent here today, Alejandro. So lots of interest from Ireland. Kieran Finlay is in the National Disability Authority. He asked the question, Alejandro mentioned plans to revise the EU Electoral Act. What are the key changes that the EDF would like to see as part of this updated legislation to strengthen the voting rights of persons with disabilities in line with the UNCRPD?
Yeah, I can tell you because that's already kind of done in a way. So we included the right to vote regardless of legal capacity status. all of this is in the Parliament proposal for a new EU electoral law that member states they need to agree on, but they haven't yet, and they will not in the near future, from my personal opinion, because it has other more controversial proposals on it. So first I will tell the disability related provisions of this proposal that are good, and I think they are not contested by member states. So in this case, it's kind of good that our parts are not that controversial. So the right to vote, regardless of legal capacity. Unfortunately, there is not the right to stand as candidate, regardless of legal capacity. So the right to vote, yes, but the right to stand is not there. The obligation for member states to maximize accessibility. The obligation to member states to provide reasonable accommodation to persons with disabilities to vote independently and in secret, and the obligation to ensure that persons with disabilities can choose their assistants of their choice, and the accessibility of the European campaigns. The campaigns run at European level by European political parties or European movements, as they call it. So these are kind of the good improvements as for persons with disabilities. The problem is that this new electoral law that the Parliament has put forward has other controversial things that the member states are not so happy to accept. Like, for example, to make everyone vote on the same day. They propose the 9th of May, which is Europe Day, or to have transnational lists instead of national lists. So we'll have a ballot paper with a number of candidates from all EU member states instead of me voting only Spanish and you only Irish candidates. The obligation to have a lead candidate, so the first in the list would be considered like the president of the European Commission. So it has some kind of other things that for member states is a no-go for the moment. And unfortunately, this is kind of blocking all the positive, other positive parts that are included in this proposal from the Parliament.
Okay.
But we'll see, and in the near future, we can see some amendments concerning only disability rights, or certain parts of this proposal included and not others. So it's still up in the air, yeah.
It's very much in the balance still, Alejandro.
Yep.
Okay, so just before we finish up, and this is only a quick I'm going to give a quick comment here. Firstly, we had a lovely comment in from Maeve Carton. Thank you, Maeve. And Maeve just noted, Alejandro, that it was a fantastic session. Many thanks to all involved, and in particular to Alejandro for his clear, informative and insightful presentation and answers. And so well done to all. Our last question for today, Alejandro, just a quick response on this. And I think this is actually a really important question and a great way to wrap up our session today. And this is a question from Barry Colfer, the Director of Research here in the IIEA. He just noted, thanks for the presentation. Can you please say what the cost of government inaction would be when it comes to electoral rights of people with disabilities, both as candidates and participants? So in what way is society worse off in such a scenario? A quick response, Alejandro.
Such a difficult question. A quick response, I don't know.
But I think it's a good way to wrap up, Alejandro.
Yeah, no, I think that the cost of not of having non-fully complete or inclusive democracy is huge, because in the end, you cannot claim yourself democratic if you have first-class citizen and second-class citizens. So our democracies reflect a little bit the society that we want to be. So I would leave it there. I mean, if we are truly about our diversity, our democracy should really reflect that.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And I think it's a absolutely an important point to make about that we would be less off as a country and a world without the voice of all of our citizens involved in decision-making processes. So on that note, Alejandro, I would like to thank you very much for coming today to give a really, really insightful presentation. And you can see how much it meant to people by the number of very detailed questions that we received and the interest that's there. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Vanessa. Vanessa, thank you for your support. And of course, to the IIEA for hosting this session. And we're looking forward to more sessions during the year. There are some wonderful topics planned for later on in the spring and the summer, and we look forward to having you attend those as well. So from all of the team here today, I'd like to wish you all a lovely afternoon, a very relaxing weekend, and I look forward to talking to you all again soon. Take care and goodbye.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.